In today's episode, we'll take a look at the Control Center app for Lewitt Connect 6 audio interfaces. This is not a review of the audio interface, although I would recommend, if you are interested in the details on that, two different reviews. Number one from Podcastage and number two from Julian Krause. I put links for both of them down below. Take a look at those if you're interested in those details. Let's talk specifically about the Connect app. Now, one of the wonderful things about the Lewitt Connect 6 is it has inbuilt digital signal processing, DSP. And what that means is that it actually has an expander, sometimes known as a noise gate, a compressor, an equalizer, and a maximizer, or what is often referred to as a limiter. So I want to run through those specifically. We're not going to talk about the other mixing features here. We're just going to focus on those particular settings. So let's go ahead and jump in first with the auto setup. Now, the auto setup will automatically set up your microphone input gain and also some of the processors as well. So let's go ahead and show you how that works. I'm using a condenser microphone. In this case, this is a Earthworks Ethos that you're hearing me talk through right now. And first, it asks you what type of microphone you're connecting. Again, this tutorial is all focused on spoken word audio, not on music, not on singing vocals, not on instruments. So if you have a condenser microphone, of course, you choose that. If you have a dynamic microphone, you choose that. If you're not sure what you have, look at the documentation for your microphone. So we're going to choose condenser microphone. The reason that's important, by the way, is that if you do choose condenser microphone, it will turn on plus 48 volts phantom power. Condenser microphones typically need that. Okay, next it asks us what we'd like to do. Of course, as we mentioned, we're doing spoken word, so we're going to choose talk. Next, it asks you if you're doing live audio, like for a live stream or a recording. And the reason it asks that is that it will do a different type of setup or configuration for you based on what you choose. If you choose live, it is assuming that you're doing a live stream, so you might want in those cases to use an expander. So it will configure the expander to manage any noise in your room. It will also set up the compressor and equalizer to kind of fine-tune your voice. If you choose recording, it is going to assume you do not want to do the expander, so it will not configure the expander. It may just look at the compressor and possibly the equalizer. So in this case, let's go ahead and choose live so we can see what that looks like. First thing it wants us to do is record an audio sample for 10 seconds, and it will figure out what kind of input level it needs to set, or a gain level specifically. Let's go ahead and do that, and let's see what it gives us. Okay, I'm talking here for 10 seconds into the Lewitt Connect 6 with the Earthworks Ethos microphone, and this is going to help us figure out what level we need. Now, not unusual, the first time it says no calibration response received, please repeat. So in that case, we'll repeat. Okay, we're doing this the second time for whatever reason. The first time it often fails. I don't understand why that is, but in any case, we're going to go ahead and repeat so that it can figure out what our level needs to be. Okay, so you can see already it changed our input level from 20 to 23 dB of gain, and I probably sound a little bit louder now, so that's about right. And you can see on our meter here, we're peaking probably, or topping out at around minus 12, maybe just a touch over that at the start of a sentence. So that's a pretty good level. Next, it's going to test to see if we have any ambient noise, and we'll go ahead and start the measure and see what it recommends there. Okay, in that second case, I didn't do any talking. I just let it record the noise in the room, the noise floor. And this is what it came up with. First of all, because we chose a condenser microphone, it turned on 48 volts phantom power. That makes sense. It pretty much always turns on the high-pass filter, which is an 80 hertz high-pass filter. That's just going to take care of any low-frequency hum or rumble or anything along those lines. Not completely take care of it, but at least reduce it some. It can also be useful for air conditioning or heating. And again, it's not a perfect solution. It doesn't absolutely remove those things, but it does help. As we noted before, it set our gain level to 23 dB of gain. It also turned on the expander and the compressor. So we'll go ahead and click Finish Setup. Okay, so that's what it gave us, and this is what it sounds like now. Let's go ahead in turn and take a look at what it did to set these up, and also how we can fine-tune it for our particular situation. So first up, we have the expander. Now, before we go any farther with the expander, I want to go ahead and turn on a noise source in our room. So we'll go ahead and turn on a fan. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn the expander off for just a moment, so you can hear that fan in the background. Okay, now we'll go ahead and turn the expander back on and kind of tune it. to get everything so that it's reducing that fan noise in an effective way, in a way that doesn't sound too obvious and that works well for us. So the first thing is we have a threshold setting. We then have a ratio, attack, release, and maximum reduction. If I stop talking, you can see a couple things. Here's our input level, the level that's coming into this expander processor. You can also see when I stop talking, this little blue line shows how much it's actually reducing the noise. Just a couple dB, maybe 3 dB. And this is the output level right here. Okay, so the main idea is you want to be able, after it's done the processing, this is the level, and you can see right now it's basically identical. It's not changing it. By the way, for any of these radial controls, if you just click in the middle and move up and down, that will change that setting for you. What we want to do here is move this up so that it's below the dialogue, and you can see it's representing the dialogue here as these sort of kind of like waveforms. These are, your audio levels here. You want the line, the threshold, to be below all of your dialogue, but above the noise floor here. And if I stop talking again, you can see that's all the noise from the fan right there. So we are technically above it, but let's see what happens if we move it up a little bit higher. And I can do that two ways. I can grab it here. And you can see as I move it up, we're starting to reduce more of that noise. Now it's reducing it by about 12 dB. So I would say somewhere in about the minus 55 range. That's pretty good. Okay. The standard ratio that it almost always applies in all of my experience with this so far is that it will always set it to 1 to 2. This is basically saying how much expansion it's doing, how much noise reduction in this case it's doing. If we set it to a higher ratio, watch what happens to the noise reduction when I stop talking. You'll notice it starts doing more noise reduction. So that's what the ratio does. It works very much like a ratio on a compressor. So the higher the ratio, the more compression it's going to do. I would probably keep it to, again, probably around 1 to 2 is probably fine, so that you're not... I think my philosophy with a expander in particular is that you don't want to push it too hard, because then it becomes really obvious to the audience, because it's not reducing any of the noise while you're talking. It's only reducing that noise when you stop talking. And so that's why it's important not to push it too hard, because it will sound really obvious. In fact, let's go ahead and do that so you can hear exactly how obvious it can sound. And here's when I start talking and when I stop talking. It's pretty obvious that that's kicking in. So let's back that off a little bit here. And I'm going to use some more reasonable settings. In this case, a 1 to 2 ratio, and in this case, we'll probably make our max reduction about 12 dB. There we go. Okay, and actually I'm going to move that threshold down a little bit as well. What the attack refers to is that when you stop talking, this is how long it waits before it really kicks in and starts reducing the noise. And you want to have a little bit of time there so it's not too obvious. But if you put too much time, it maybe is a little bit more obvious. So here's an example of using an attack that's probably too slow. Hear how it kind of eases in over the course of 3/4 of a second. So usually about 0.2, which is 200 milliseconds, is about right in my experience for most spoken word. You might need to tune that a little bit depending on how quickly you're talking, or what maybe the type of voice that you have. But I think 200 milliseconds or 0.2 is a pretty good setting. Now, when you do start talking again, the release is what defines how quickly it turns off the compressor, or the expander in this case. So you definitely probably want to leave that right around 10 milliseconds. If you go too long, this is what'll happen, is it'll cut off the first part of your next sentence. So you have to be really careful with that. So I would generally leave that at about 10 milliseconds. That's enough that doesn't sound too obvious, but it also doesn't get in the way. It doesn't keep reducing the levels when you start talking. And then finally is maximum reduction. And in this case, I generally recommend -12 or less if you can. Again, the philosophy from my standpoint is just to make the background noise less noticeable, not to absolutely crush it into oblivion, because when you crush it into oblivion, it's very obvious that you're crushing it into oblivion. So I would stay away from that. So that's how I would set up the expander. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn off the fan for now. Now, as the fan is spinning down, just a thought here. If you've got a fan like that running in your room, you probably need to take care of the fan. Just turn it off. That's the best approach from my point of view. But the expander's there if you absolutely need it. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off for now. And next, let's go into the compressor. So what does a compressor do? A compressor, you can see here, it's representing my talking right here in this graph. And the y-axis here is amplitude, how loud I get at certain points. And then, of course, we have a threshold here. And anytime the audio, the spoken word, gets above that threshold, you can see that the compressor kicks in. You can see it's a little bit jerky, herky-jerky here, and that is because the app is just that way. It's not because my computer isn't powerful enough. This is a Mac Studio with plenty of resources, but for whatever reason, that's what it does. So whenever the audio goes above the threshold, then it does its compression. It pushes those levels down a little bit, and then once you've done that, you can also do what's called makeup gain. So you push those loudest parts down just a little bit to reduce your overall dynamic range, the difference between the loudest parts and the quietest parts. And then once you've reduced those loudest parts a little bit, you can push the overall levels up. So it has two effects. Number one, it evens out the dialogue. And number two, it allows you to make the audio just a little bit louder, a little bit more present, and a little bit easier for your audience to listen to. So that's what we use a compressor for typically. Now, this one also has the input and the output meters. You'll notice that the output meter is consistently higher. That's because we're doing some makeup gain here. We're adding 6 dB of gain after the audio goes through the compressor. And you can also see here, we have a little meter here, the red that comes down from the top here. That's the amount of gain reduction it's doing at any given moment. And then we also have that represented over here in red on this graph. That shows when it's actually doing some compression. And you'll notice it mostly happens at the start of the sentences or when I get really, really loud. If I get up close to the microphone and talk louder, you can see it does more compression. So let's talk about how to set this up. The auto setup actually does a pretty good job, I'd say. You really don't want to push the compressor hard. You just really want to even things out a little bit, and it's doing that pretty nicely here, actually. So the first setting, of course, is the threshold. And just like I described earlier, when your audio goes above that threshold, that's when the compressor starts doing its job. Otherwise, it doesn't touch the audio. All right, so the next is a ratio. A ratio is how much it's going to squash the audio down once it does exceed that threshold. Now, 4:1 is a pretty good place to be for spoken word audio in my experience. And what that means is that when the audio, at least in kind of theoretical terms, when the audio goes above the threshold by, say, 4 dB, it would actually push that down. It will compress it so that it's only 1 dB above the threshold, generally how it works. And again, if you push it really, really hard, I think it starts to sound pretty unusual. Let's go ahead and do that just so you can hear what that sounds like. So I'm going to drop the threshold, and now we're doing a lot more compression, and you can see or hear, actually use your ears here, don't worry about the visuals. You can hear that it's really affecting my voice in a pretty extreme way. So let me go ahead and drop that back out, and let's drop that ratio back down to 4:1. 4:1 seems to be a much better place to be. Now, even if I drop the threshold again and it really starts compressing, it's going to be a little bit more transparent. It's still going to sound that it's obviously compressing, but it's a little bit more transparent. And again, that's why you want to generally choose somewhere around 4:1 for spoken word audio. Okay, next is attack and release. These kind of go together. What the attack does is that when the audio exceeds the threshold, it essentially waits this long. The full compression doesn't happen until you're this far into it. In other words, once the audio exceeds the threshold, it takes this long before the full compression ratio is kicked in. That's essentially what that means. And then on the other end, once the audio drops below the threshold, it takes this long before it lets go. It turns off the compressor again. So in this case, we're doing 10 milliseconds attack. So once the audio exceeds the threshold, it will not get to its full 4:1 compression ratio until it's been 10 milliseconds. And for the release, once it drops below the threshold, it waits 80 milliseconds before it lets go and stops compressing. Now, generally for spoken word, I would keep it around 10 milliseconds on the attack. And then for the release, you could go a little bit longer than that. Maybe 200 milliseconds would be okay. What you'll notice is a difference here is if I go really long, what happens is it starts to also, it takes a while before it turns off the compressor. And so things like breaths become more kind of prominent, because what it's now doing is it's actually compressing those breaths as well. And you really don't want to do that. So that's why I would generally stay somewhere closer to 200 milliseconds. That's 0.2 on this. Or where it actually originally recommended 80 milliseconds, somewhere in there. I'd probably go somewhere in between the two of them. Let's go at 200 milliseconds. And that's about what that sounds like there. Okay, I think the idea generally in terms of setting the threshold, you don't want to be compressing really hard. Again, if I move this threshold way down, you can barely hear me, and it's way over compressing. And so what we want to do is I generally want to set this so that it's just barely getting the loudest peaks, maybe at the start of the sentences. So for example, here at the start of the sentence, it starts compressing, and then once we get past that, it doesn't do nearly as much compressing until I get to the start of the next sentence. And that's, a lot of people will kind of talk that way, louder at the start of the sentence and then sort of mellow out in the rest of the sentence. So I would say that you're really looking for this to just kind of tickle the compressor, not constantly have it engaged. So just a little bit of compression every now and again to even things out generally works well. And then you have your makeup gain. What I would do here is look at over these meters over here on the right-hand side. What you want to do is just keep your eye on this here. You know, our levels now are peaking somewhere around minus 12-ish, and I think that's a pretty comfortable level. You just don't want to do too much makeup gain. If you really start to push it, here's 12 dB of makeup gain. And we're still in a pretty safe area. We're still peaking at about minus 6. But I would save that for the maximizer. I think we're going to just do about 6 dB of gain. Make that up, and I think we're in a good spot there. Okay, so that is the compressor. Now, let's talk about the EQ. Now, there are a couple things you can do with this EQ. I'm going to go ahead and just sort of reset these here and turn that one off. We can actually turn these off as well. What the EQ does for you, it allows you to, I think the way I think of it typically is that you can use it to correct problems. Specifically, if you have a recording or a voice and a microphone combination that just kind of sounds a little bit too harsh, you can use this to help remove some of that harshness, and it will just make the voice sound a little bit more natural. Or if you want to, you can do some sweetening. They're kind of the same thing at some level, but let me just show you a couple things here. You can actually use the band 1 for a low cut filter or high pass filter. They're the same thing. They just roll off the low frequencies. And again, that's going to help with any sort of low frequency sound you may have in your space. And it doesn't usually cut into the dialogue. If you, for example, we're at, 51 hertz. We're usually fine with, even with men's voices, if you go up to somewhere maybe around 65, that usually will be okay. It won't cut off a lot of the low end, and that can be a helpful thing. So if you want to do that, this is available here. You can also change the different types of points that you're using here. So for example, over here on band 2, let's go ahead and turn band 2 on. And let me just demonstrate how I would go about doing a couple things. Now, if I boost this up, let's go ahead and boost it up right here. First I need to turn it on. Make sure you turn it on. So when I turn this off or move this point back down, and then I boost it up, you should be able to hear a substantial difference. We're getting a lot more of the 1 kilohertz range here. And I could also sweep it over a little bit, and here's the 2 kilohertz range. These kind of start to sound a little bit like a 1940s microphone recording. Not a great sound. But this is one technique you can use to find the places where it's harsh. Here's like a super bass boost. You don't want to do that. That can be really fatiguing to listen to. But here, for example, this sounds really, really harsh to me. My voice, this microphone, this particular frequency sounds really, really harsh. And what you can do is you can actually drop that down. Maybe do just a mild cut here. Now what you can do as well, actually before I do that, let me just do one other thing. If I hold down the command button and then move my mouse up and down, I can change how narrow that boost or cut is with this particular point. And so I might want to do something a little bit more targeted here. So that's changing the width or the Q, kind of related concepts, not exactly the same. Oh, but notice that right there. Hear how that sounds? There's a good example of the kind of harshness that you want to probably get rid of. So what I can do then is just take this and pull it right on down. And I don't want to do a huge cut, just a few dB, maybe 3 dB is a good place to start. So let's do that with this one as well. What I'm going to do first is, again, hold down the Command key, and I'm going to make this a much narrower kind of point here. Now let's go ahead and pull that up here. Oh, whoops, we got to turn that on. If it doesn't do anything, you got to make sure it's powered on here. So now we're powered on. Okay, here is, ooh, listen to that. Not good. And I could sweep it back and forth and see what I get at these different frequencies here. Here again is a super bass boost. Ooh, that gets really resonant there. Ooh, my goodness, not good there. A whole bunch of spots there. This one is sounding pretty harsh to me as well. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this one by about 3 dB as well. So that's going to be a pretty mild way to do it. If I wanted to widen those up to really kind of make it a wider area that it cuts, again, I can change the Q. Maybe drop it down like maybe to 1.3. Let's do the same over here. Whoops. Again, just about a 3 dB cut. And then I hold down the the Command key, and we'll widen that back up. Okay, so here is with the EQ turned on, and here is with the EQ turned off so that you can hear the difference. Now, I don't think this particular microphone needs a lot of that. So take it easy. It's always less is more. I think I would probably just boost this up a little bit. Doesn't need that much of a change with my particular mic. You can also take this, if you do have a lot of sibilance, you can use this as sort of a de-esser. It's kind of a crude way of doing that, but if you can pull this down, she sells seashells. As I say, well, first of all, what is sibilance? Sibilance is a sizzling sound you hear when someone says the letter S or C. And usually that will happen somewhere between 5 kilohertz, maybe 4 kilohertz, up to about 10 kilohertz. And the idea is you want to cut some of that. It's not the best way to do it, but if you're in a desperate spot where you have a lot of sibilance and you need to to manage it, I would go ahead and turn this on and then start saying, she sells seashells by the seashore. Now here's something interesting. She sells seashells by the seashore. She sells seashells by the seashore. She sells seashells by the seashore. Notice how it's starting to sound. She sells seashells by the seashore. A little lispy. You've probably found the frequency where the sibilance is, and you want to back off. You don't want to do anything too extreme there, but that's one way you can take care of sibilance as well with an EQ. All right, now we've also got this gain here. So again, if once you start pulling things down here, your output level is going to be a little bit lower. So you can boost it up here by a few dB if you need to do that. And that's how the equalizer works. Once we have our compressor and equalizer set, we're probably pretty good here, but we could turn on the maximizer as well. And the maximizer does two things. Number one, it boosts the audio levels, but it also has a limiter. So if you boost a little too far, or you happen to get a little loud and it gets through the compressor, this also has a limiter which will push those levels down and prevent the audio from clipping. So there's my jacket you heard just a moment ago. Let's go ahead and turn the maximizer on and see what we get here. Okay, here is the maximizer. Now, you'll notice here when I get a little louder, it will actually use the limiter to push the levels down. It's starting to sound a little distorted to me. I'm going to pull that back. What we're looking for is our meters over here. We don't want to be up against 0 the whole time. So I'm going to pull it back just a little bit. I'd like to be maybe peaking around -6. And this will give us just that little extra boost we need to get there. Now, if you see this little orange dot here, when that grows, that means it's limiting. So if I talk pretty loud here, you can see it's pushing those levels down a little bit. It grows and shows that it's okay, pushing down. So that's how the maximizer works. I think it's a bit much, to be honest. I think back here is about where we need to be. So this is about where I would go for this particular setup here. Okay, so hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.